My name is James, and until recently, I had always believed in the sanctity of the promises made within marriage. Rebecca, my wife of 8 years, was my partner, my confidant, and the one with whom I envisioned a future of shared dreams. We had built a life together in a modest suburban home, a place filled with memories of laughter, late-night conversations, and quiet moments of understanding. But one autumn evening, that carefully constructed world began to crumble. It started subtly, with small inconsistencies that I initially brushed aside. Rebecca would come home later than usual, her eyes carrying an unspoken sadness, or she would receive text messages at odd hours that she quickly hid when I entered the room. At first, I questioned my own imagination. After all, in every marriage there are moments of silence and space. It didn't necessarily mean that something was amiss. Yet, as the weeks turned into months, the feeling of unease grew into a relentless gnawing at my core. One chilly evening, as the wind howled outside our window and rain drummed softly on the roof, I returned home earlier than expected. I intended to surprise Rebecca with a small dinner, a token of my love after a long day at work. I paused at the threshold of our living room when I noticed an envelope lying on the coffee table. My name was scrawled on it in Rebecca's handwriting, but what struck me was that it wasn't a note of affection. Instead, it contained printed photos and cryptic messages exchanged between her and someone I had never heard of, a man named Daniel. The images revealed intimate moments, stolen glances, and what unmistakably appeared to be secret rendezvous. My heart pounded in my chest as I grappled with the realization that the woman I loved had been unfaithful. In that silent, heart-wrenching moment, time slowed to a crawl. I sank into our old, worn-out armchair, clutching the envelope as if it were a piece of shattered glass, each fragment a reminder of a broken promise. The initial shock gave way to a turbulent storm of emotions, anger, sorrow, and a crushing sense of betrayal. I replayed every conversation, every touch, every shared glance, questioning if I had somehow missed the signs or if I had simply been too blinded by love to see the truth. The following days were a haze of sleepless nights and restless wandering. I found myself pacing the corridors of our once happy home, the walls now echoing with the ghostly remnants of happier times. Each room seemed to whisper secrets of a life that was no longer mine. I confronted myself with bitter self-reproach. Had I been too complacent? Had I neglected Rebecca in ways I hadn't even recognized? These thoughts tormented me as much as the betrayal itself. In the midst of my inner turmoil, fate intervened in the most unexpected manner. One rainy afternoon, while seeking refuge in a small, dimly lit cafe, I encountered an old acquaintance, Mark. He was a man whose presence in my life had always been fleeting, a friendly face in a crowd, never really someone I considered close. Yet today, his arrival sent a ripple of unease through me. Mark's eyes held a hint of sadness as he approached, and before I could muster a greeting, he leaned in and spoke in a low, urgent tone. "James, I'm sorry you have to find out like this," he began, his voice trembling with regret. "I never meant to cause more pain, but I think you deserve to know the truth about Rebecca." My blood ran cold as Mark continued, explaining that he had been in contact with Rebecca recently and had overheard details of her secret meetings with Daniel, a man she had been seeing long before our marriage began to falter. Mark's words, heavy with remorse, confirmed the worst of my fears. I sat there, numb, absorbing every word like a bitter medicine. Mark's revelation was a stark confirmation of the evidence I had uncovered on my own. The hurt was now mingled with a burning need for answers. I demanded to know every detail, how long it had been going on, the circumstances that led to these clandestine meetings, and whether Rebecca ever intended to end the affair. Mark's eyes filled with regret as he admitted that he had tried to warn me, but the truth was often like water slipping through one's grasp, impossible to hold on to until it was too late. That evening, as the rain continued its relentless patter on the pavement outside, I returned home with a heart heavy with sorrow and a mind buzzing with unanswered questions. I found Rebecca in our bedroom, her eyes red from tears, her expression a mixture of guilt and defiance. The confrontation was inevitable. Standing before her, I struggled to find words that could encapsulate the magnitude of my shattered trust. "Rebecca," I said, my voice raw and trembling, "I found the envelope, the messages, everything. How long has this been going on?" Her silence was deafening, her gaze avoiding mine as she fumbled for words. Finally, with a shaky sigh, she admitted that the affair had started months ago, a time when she claimed to have felt lost and alone in our marriage. Every word she uttered only deepened the void inside me. The warmth of our shared past was now replaced by a cold, unyielding bitterness. In that moment, the man I had known, the one who had once shared dreams with me, seemed to vanish. All that remained was the bitter truth of betrayal. The discussion escalated into a storm of accusations and regret. Rebecca's justifications, though laced with remorse, did nothing to mend the deep chasm between us. I could no longer ignore the reality that the love we once shared had been irrevocably tarnished by deceit. The chapter of our shared life, filled with memories both joyful and painful, was now coming to an end. In the midst of our confrontation, the air grew thick with hostility. I realized that this betrayal wasn't just a single act, it was the culmination of neglected feelings, unspoken grievances, and the slow decay of trust that had been allowed to fester over time. The realization was as brutal as it was clear: our marriage was irreparably broken. As I stood there in the dim light of our bedroom, I felt an overwhelming sense of finality. The future that I had once envisioned with Rebecca was no longer within reach. The journey of betrayal had led us to this inescapable crossroad, and with every passing second, the distance between us grew. The painful knowledge that the person I once loved had chosen another was a wound that would take time to heal, if it healed at all. I left the room that night with a heavy heart, the silence of our home echoing the end of what had once been a promise of forever. In the quiet of the night, as I penned my thoughts in a journal, I knew that the path ahead was uncertain. The road to healing was shrouded in darkness, and the only certainty was that the man I once was had been irrevocably changed. The bitter taste of betrayal, mingled with the shards of a broken dream, was a constant reminder that some wounds run too deep to ever truly mend. I resolved to face the coming days with the strength I had to summon, even as the shadow of hostility loomed over our crumbling union. The journey to reclaim my own identity had begun, and though it would be fraught with pain and difficult decisions, it was a journey I had no choice but to undertake. The man I was, the man I wanted to be, was waiting on the other side of this storm, a man who would rise from the ashes of shattered trust, even if it meant walking away from everything I once held dear. And so, with the weight of betrayal anchoring my soul, I stepped into the unknown, leaving behind a marriage that had become a battleground of broken promises and bitter regrets, a final, hostile divergence that marked the end of an era and the painful beginning of a new, solitary path. The days following that harrowing night were a blur, a relentless cycle of sorrow, anger, and a sense of profound disillusionment. In the immediate aftermath of Rebecca's confession, the very fabric of my existence had begun to unravel. Every familiar corner of our home, every object that once held a piece of our shared past, now seemed tainted by the bitter residue of betrayal. I remember waking up the next morning with the weight of despair pressing on my chest. The silence in our bedroom was deafening, each minute stretching into an eternity of loneliness. I sat on the edge of our unmade bed, trying to recall the warmth of her presence that had once so comforted me. Instead, all I felt was an icy emptiness. I felt as though I had been robbed of my future, of the dreams we had woven together, now reduced to nothing but shattered promises and half-truths. The hours that followed were spent in a daze. I wandered the halls of our once cherished home, every step echoing with memories of laughter, shared secrets, and the gentle cadence of our once harmonious lives. Now, each room seemed to whisper reminders of what had been lost. The coffee table where we had spent lazy Sunday mornings, the bookshelf filled with volumes of novels we once read together, each held a ghostly trace of the love that had crumbled into dust. I couldn't escape the relentless onslaught of recollections. Even the simple act of opening a window brought with it the chill of a world that had turned unrecognizable. In a desperate bid to make sense of it all, I reached out to Mark again. His presence had been the catalyst for that dreadful night, and I needed more clarity, more details to stitch together the fragments of the truth that had shattered me. We met at a quiet park near the edge of town, where the dying remnants of winter clung to the bare trees. Mark's face was drawn and tired, as if he, too, had been haunted by the consequences of his actions. As we sat on a cold, weathered bench, the conversation began in halting, regretful tones. "James," Mark started, his voice quivering with remorse, "I wish I could change the way things unfolded. I tried to warn you, but it was like the truth slipped through my fingers." His words, though earnest, only deepened the ache inside me. I pressed him for more details, questions about the duration of the affair, about how Rebecca had managed to keep such a secret hidden from me for so long. Mark's revelations were painful, each one a further stab to my already wounded pride. He admitted that the affair had been an ongoing deception, one that had spanned months, even years, and that Rebecca had become adept at compartmentalizing her life. With each detail, I felt the gnawing of betrayal intensify, as if I were slowly being dismantled piece by piece. The more I learned, the more I realized that this was not a momentary lapse of judgment, but a sustained, deliberate betrayal. A surge of anger welled up inside me, a burning desire to reclaim the dignity I felt was being stripped away with every new revelation. Mark's words were like acid, dissolving the last vestiges of the illusion that had once been our marriage. I returned home with a storm raging within me. The corridors of our house no longer felt like a sanctuary, but a prison constructed from the remnants of trust that had long since decayed. I found myself haunted by visions of Rebecca and Daniel, two faces that had come to symbolize the fractured parts of my life. In moments of solitude, I imagined the clandestine meetings, the whispered promises exchanged behind closed doors, and it all painted a picture of a life I never signed up for. I decided that I could no longer remain in the suffocating environment of our shared home. With each passing hour, the urge to escape grew stronger. I began packing a bag with essentials, clothes, a few cherished mementos, and my journal, which had become both a confidant and a record of my inner turmoil. I didn't know where I was headed, but I knew I had to get away from the suffocating atmosphere of betrayal that had once been my haven. The act of packing was a stark, painful acknowledgement that this was not merely a temporary phase, but the beginning of a permanent, hostile separation. Before leaving, I felt compelled to write one last letter to Rebecca, a letter that would encapsulate the betrayal, the sorrow, and the irreparable fissures in our marriage. Sitting at the old oak desk in our study, I tried to articulate the whirlwind of emotions that had consumed me. Each word felt like a confession of the pain I had endured, a testament to the love that had once been pure but had now turned bitter with mistrust. I wrote of shattered dreams, broken promises, and a future that had been cruelly snatched away. Yet, as I penned the final lines, I realized that words could never fully capture the depth of my despair. The letter was not an invitation for reconciliation, it was a final goodbye, an acknowledgement that our paths were destined to diverge, permanently and irreversibly. That evening, as twilight descended and painted the sky in somber hues, I left the house. With each step away from the home that had once cradled my happiness, I felt a strange mixture of relief and mourning. The road ahead was uncertain, a desolate journey paved with the debris of broken trust and relentless regret. But it was a journey I had to embark on if I were ever to reclaim the parts of myself that had been lost in the wake of betrayal. As I drove away, the darkness of the night seemed to mirror the void inside me. I reflected on the countless moments I had spent believing in a love that was, in reality, built on a foundation of deceit. The journey of the past few days had forced me to confront the brutal truth, that the person I once trusted was capable of inflicting wounds that would take years to heal. And as the miles receded behind me, so too did the remnants of the life I had known, a life that now belonged only to the past. In the solitude of the journey, I felt the cold clarity of a man who had been irrevocably changed. The betrayal had stripped me bare, leaving me with nothing but the raw, unfiltered truth of my own vulnerability. Yet, in that stark honesty, I also found the first fragile glimmer of resolve, a determination to rebuild my life, piece by shattered piece, even if the road was fraught with bitterness and hostile memories. The days ahead promised no immediate solace, no swift path to healing. There would be moments of searing pain, of reminders that the trust one had once taken for granted was now a casualty of deception. But I also recognized that every end, however painful, carried the seeds of a new beginning. And so, even as I mourned the love that had betrayed me, I also braced myself for the possibility of rediscovering a life free from the chains of a broken marriage. In that bitter, reflective solitude, I came to understand that sometimes, the only way to reclaim one's identity is to confront the harshest of truths, even if it means accepting that the journey forward is one of hostile divergence, marked by the scars of betrayal and the bitter resolve to never again be defined by another's treachery. And so, with a heavy heart and a mind brimming with both despair and defiance, I moved forward into the uncertain night, each mile a step away from the past, and each moment a painful reminder that the road to redemption is paved with the remnants of shattered dreams. In the weeks following my departure from the house, the world felt like a disjointed canvas of raw emotions and unrelenting memories. Each day presented its own torment, an agonizing reminder of the betrayal that had unraveled my entire life. I wandered aimlessly through the city streets, haunted by the echoes of laughter and whispered promises that once filled the corners of our home. Even the gentle patter of rain against the pavement felt like a melancholic dirge for what had been lost. Yet, despite my desperate need to escape the pain, a part of me, fragile but persistent, demanded answers. I couldn't help but feel that Rebecca, too, was a prisoner of the lies and half-truths that had entangled us. The letter I had written, that final farewell filled with sorrow and bitter resolve, remained unsent on my desk, a silent testament to the turmoil raging inside me. I oscillated between wanting to sever all ties and a deep-rooted desire to confront the woman who had shattered my trust, to force her to confront her own reflections of the damage she'd inflicted. One chilly evening, when the sky was a slate of bruise-like purples and blues, I found myself outside the modest apartment complex we had once called home. The familiar facade, once a sanctuary of warmth and memories, now loomed like a specter of lost dreams. I hesitated for only a moment before stepping through the front door, determined that this night would be the turning point, a night where the dam of pent-up anger and pain would finally burst forth. Inside, the silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of the wind rattling the windows. I made my way cautiously to our living room, the letter still clutched tightly in my hand. My heart pounded as I reached the doorway of the room where Rebecca had retreated. I knocked, the sound echoing down the empty hall. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open. There she stood, Rebecca, her eyes red and puffy as if the tears had only just dried. There was an air of weariness about her, a resignation that spoke of the emotional battles fought in silence over the past weeks. For a moment, our eyes locked, and in that brief encounter, I saw both the regret of a woman who had lost herself and the indifference of someone determined to shield herself from the pain. "James," she said softly, a tremor in her voice that betrayed her inner turmoil. Without preamble, I stepped into the room. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I lowered the letter on the coffee table, its presence a silent witness to all that had been unsaid between us. She hesitated, then motioned for me to sit. As I sank into the worn sofa, a flood of memories rushed back, quiet mornings with shared coffee, laughter that filled every corner of our home, and promises of forever that now lay in tatters. The contrast between those cherished moments and the current desolation was too stark, too painful. "Rebecca," I began, struggling to find the words that could encapsulate the searing betrayal, "I need you to be honest with me. I need to understand, was there ever a moment when you truly loved what we had? Or was everything just a facade for something else?" Her eyes flickered with a mixture of sorrow and defiance. "James, I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the low hum of the night. "I never intended to hurt you. I I felt trapped, suffocated by expectations that I couldn't live up to. I made choices, terrible choices, and now I'm paying for them every day. Her words, though laced with remorse, only deepened the void within me. Trapped? I repeated bitterly. You chose to escape by seeking solace in another man, with Daniel, without even giving me a chance to understand or help. You betrayed everything we once stood for. A silence stretched between us, a chasm filled with memories of trust, now shattered. I know I hurt you, Rebecca said finally, her eyes filling with tears, but it wasn't just about Daniel. It was about me. I was lost, and I didn't know how to find myself within the confines of our life. Her admission stung, not merely because of the betrayal itself, but because it confirmed the painful truth that she had given up on us long before I ever discovered her infidelity. The weight of her words was crushing, and for a long moment, I couldn't respond. I felt as if I were drowning in a sea of regret and resentment. Then why? I demanded, my voice rising despite my efforts to keep it under control. Why didn't you talk to me? Why didn't you trust me enough to try and fix what was wrong? Instead, you made your escape, leaving me in the dark while you built a life on secrets. Rebecca's gaze fell, and the silence that followed was filled only with the sound of my labored breathing. I didn't know how, she admitted, almost inaudibly. I was afraid that if I told you the truth, that you'd leave me, and I couldn't bear that. I was scared, James. Her fear, rather than eliciting sympathy, only fanned the flames of my fury. So you chose deception over honesty? I spat, my voice laden with venom. You chose betrayal over trust? Her eyes searched mine, pleading silently for some semblance of understanding, but I could only see the reflection of my own broken heart. I'm sorry, she repeated, as if that word could mend the fractures that now lay between us. I'm so sorry. But apologies, I realized, were empty echoes in the face of irreversible damage. In that moment, the woman I had once loved became a stranger, a person whose actions had irrevocably altered the course of my life. The conversation spiraled into an outpouring of grievances and accusations, a cathartic release of all the pent-up pain that had festered for far too long. You never really cared, did you? I accused, the words sharp and unyielding. You only cared about escaping your own misery, and in doing so, you left me to deal with the fallout. Her face contorted with hurt, yet there was a stubborn glint in her eyes, a defiant spark that refused to be dimmed even by my onslaught. And what about you? She shot back. Were you ever there for me? Or were you too wrapped up in your own world to notice the cracks forming between us? The volley of accusations continued, each word a brick in the wall that was now irreparably separating us. It was a bitter, painful clash, a confrontation where neither of us emerged victorious, only more deeply wounded. The realization settled over me like a shroud. This wasn't about blame anymore, it was about the mutual disintegration of what we once believed was unbreakable. As the night grew deeper, so did the chasm between us. The room, once filled with shared dreams and soft whispers, now echoed with harsh words and the unmistakable finality of a relationship in ruins. We sat there, two people adrift in a sea of sorrow and anger, each word carving a path toward an inevitable, hostile separation. In the final moments of that bitter confrontation, I rose from the sofa, my voice cold and resolute. I can't do this anymore, Rebecca, I said, my tone leaving no room for negotiation. I've tried to find answers, to salvage something from the wreckage, but all I see is a future built on lies. Her eyes brimmed with unshed tears, yet even then, there was an unyielding hardness, a quiet acceptance of the truth we both now understood. Maybe this is how it has to be, she whispered. Maybe we're better off apart. I left that apartment that night with a heavy heart and a mind burdened by the weight of shattered dreams. As I walked away from the place that had once been home, the hostile words exchanged echoed in my ears, a grim reminder that the love we once shared had disintegrated into bitterness and regret. The confrontation had not provided the closure I had hoped for, but it had made one thing unmistakably clear: our paths were now irrevocably diverged, and the future held nothing but the pain of separation. The hostile chasm between us was now fully drawn, a final, indelible mark on a love that had once been my sanctuary. And as I disappeared into the cold night, I knew that I was stepping into a life defined not by what we had lost, but by the painful resolve to never again be betrayed by those I once trusted. In the weeks following that tumultuous confrontation, I found myself walking a thin line between bitter nostalgia and the cold determination to move on. Each day dawned as an unwelcome reminder of what once was, a marriage filled with dreams, laughter, and shared promises, and what it had inevitably become, a battleground of wounded pride and unhealed sorrow. I had long resigned myself to the fact that the life I knew with Rebecca was irrevocably over, yet the final act of severance had yet to be written. I spent my mornings alone, wandering the city streets in a haze of introspection. The very air around me seemed to pulse with memories of the past: the park where we once picnicked under the bright summer sun, the cafe where we shared whispered hopes for our future, and even the silent corridors of our old home, now nothing more than a mausoleum for lost affection. The sights, sounds, and smells all conspired to remind me of a love that had been, but would never be again. Every step I took was heavy with the knowledge that the person I had once cherished was now a stranger, whose betrayal had carved deep scars into the fabric of my soul. One gray afternoon, as rain began to fall in a gentle, almost apologetic drizzle, I received a message from Rebecca. It was brief, a single sentence asking if we could meet at the old bench in the park one last time. I hesitated, knowing that every meeting would dredge up memories both sweet and agonizing. But a part of me, no matter how battered, needed closure, even if it meant revisiting the raw edges of our final moments together. I arrived at the park just as the rain softened, the droplets glistening on the leaves like tears on a sorrowful face. There she was, sitting alone on that familiar bench, her expression guarded and distant. For a moment, time seemed to freeze as I approached her, the world around us faded, leaving only the silent testimony of our shared past. "Rebecca," I began, my voice barely rising above the soft patter of the rain. She looked up, her eyes reflecting a mixture of regret and resolute finality. There was no welcome, no invitation to ease the pain, only an unspoken acknowledgement that nothing could undo what had been done. "I got your message," she replied, her tone flat, as if reciting lines from a well-worn script. "We need to end this chapter once and for all." The words, as final as they were, carried no warmth. Instead, they echoed the cold truth that we had both reached the inevitable conclusion. The park, once a sanctuary of shared dreams, now served as the stage for our final act, a hostile separation that left no room for reconciliation. I sat down beside her, the space between us a chasm filled with mutual hurt and unresolved anger. "I came here thinking that maybe we could talk things through," I said, attempting to bridge the gap with words that felt hollow even as they left my lips. "I thought we needed closure, for both our sakes." Rebecca's eyes hardened. "Closure?" she scoffed. "There's no closure in a betrayal like this, James. There's only the harsh reality of what we've become." Her words were not meant to wound, but they cut as deeply as any physical blow, a stark reminder that the trust we had once shared was beyond repair. I looked away, struggling to steady the torrent of emotions that surged within me. I tried to understand, Rebecca. I really did. But every time I searched for the person I once loved, all I found was a stranger haunted by her own mistakes. Silence fell over us, a heavy, oppressive silence filled with everything we had left unsaid. The soft murmur of the rain was the only sound, punctuating our quiet despair. In that moment, I realized that any hope of salvaging even a remnant of what we had was futile. The wounds were too deep, the bitterness too entrenched. Rebecca broke the silence with a cold finality. "James, we're not the same people we were. You've held on to the past, and I've tried to escape it. But in the end, our paths have diverged. I can't live with the lies and guilt, and you can't live with the betrayal and hurt. Her words, though honest, were like the closing of a door that once promised refuge but now barred any possibility of reunion. I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow, relief that the charade was finally over, and sorrow for the love that had perished beneath the weight of our mutual failures. "Then this is it," I said quietly, my voice trembling with finality. "There is no coming back from here." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the folded letter I had once written as a farewell, the one that had never found its way to her. "Everything I said there, it's all true. We've become enemies in a war we never wanted to fight." Rebecca's eyes flashed with an emotion I could no longer decipher. Was it anger, or perhaps a lingering sadness for the remnants of the past? "Maybe we were never really enemies," she replied bitterly. "Maybe we were just two people who lost their way and ended up destroying something that once meant everything to both of us." But there was no reconciliation in her tone, no spark of the love we had once nurtured. Only a quiet acceptance of the fact that our journey together was now at its bitter end. "I'm sorry, James," she said, and that apology felt as empty as the promises we had once made. "I'm truly sorry for everything, but I can't continue like this." Her apology was the final nail in the coffin, a symbolic closure to a relationship that had decayed beyond repair. I rose from the bench, feeling the chill of the rain and the colder truth that our lives were now meant to diverge permanently. "I wish things could have been different," I murmured, though the words rang hollow against the harsh reality. "But this is our new beginning, a beginning that doesn't include each other." With that, I turned and walked away, the path ahead shrouded in a fog of unresolved pain and the bitter promise of independence. As I left the park, I could still hear Rebecca's soft, almost inaudible whisper carried by the wind, a farewell mingled with regret and finality. It was a hostile divergence, a deliberate parting of ways that left no room for hope or reconciliation. That final meeting marked the end of an era, a chapter defined by betrayal, hurt, and ultimately, a mutual decision to separate. There would be no shared future, no merging of dreams and hopes. Instead, we were now two individuals walking divergent paths, burdened by the scars of our past yet determined to forge separate futures. I knew that the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but it was a road I had to travel alone, unencumbered by the ghosts of a love that had once been. As I disappeared into the swirling mist of the city night, the echo of our final words lingered in my mind. There was no solace in the distance, only the unyielding truth that sometimes, the only way to heal is to let go completely, even if it means parting in hostility, forever severing the bond that once held us together. And so, with a heavy heart and a resolute spirit, I embraced my new beginning, determined to rebuild my life from the fragments of what had once been, and to never again be tethered to a past defined by betrayal.